Welcome to Optimus Minimus, and this is the third video in our series about the Scandalous Emperors of Rome. Please check the first two videos about Gaius Caligula and Nero. They also contain a general introduction that establishes certain ideas and our approach to the subject. Today, we're discussing Commodus. First, let's see how Commodus sits with the other two bad emperors we discussed previously. The main problem with Commodus is the consequences. Let me elaborate a little bit. The long-term consequences of Caligula's reign were, well, nothing, no tangible consequences. Nero's reign, well, a short civil war, one tumultuous year, and then Vespasian arrives and things are business as usual. And actually even better than usual. The reign of Commodus. On the paper, it looks pretty much like Nero's. Short period of instability, short civil war, and, in the end, the arrival of a capable politician with a military background. But this capable politician was Septimius Severus, a ruthless Phoenician, Carthaginian in origin, ruler who transformed the empire into military dictatorship, introduced foreign religious practices, and started a dynasty that led Rome into the darkness of the crisis of the 3rd century. We cannot blame Commodus for all of this, but he definitely started this process. So while what we see in the sources is essentially Nero's doppelgänger, and Commodus even ruled practically the same number of years as Nero, there was no Vespasian to save the day. There was Pertinax, though. He could emulate Vespasian, but he was killed. Just like before, we should start with the sources. And just like before, just like always I should say, we don't have many. We have very little, and some of them are not very trustworthy, or exist in fragments. We have Cassius Dio, who is believed to be a contemporary of Commodus. But we shouldn't be so sure about it. We have Herodian and his Historia post Marcum Aurelium, and we have notoriously unreliable Historia Augusta. That's pretty much it. 3 primary sources. Cassius Dio is doing his thing, and his account is basically a variation of his extremely biased story on Nero, minus the anecdotes about sexual depravity, replaced by the descriptions of gladiatorial combat. Herodian's account is surprisingly moderate. It has a coherent narrative, and it actually makes sense. The account presented in Historia Augusta and credited to a fictional character of Aelius Lampridius is, well, it's not a historical account. It is the ravings of a madman, completely unreadable. Commodus was the son and the heir of Marcus Aurelius, although there were rumors that in fact Commodus wasn't really a biological son of Marcus, but a son of his wife from her adulterous relationship with somebody else, possibly a gladiator. This story is not as stupid as it may seem, and even if it's true, there are reasons why someone like Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher, decided to raise his wife's child as his own son and appoint him as his successor. As probably everybody knows, Commodus was the first emperor who was born in purple, meaning he was born during the reign of his father. Marcus obviously hired him the best teachers he could find and speed-tracked him through the government positions, including making him a consul at the age of 15. Commodus was also declared the emperor and Augustus. So from the age of 16, he was technically a co-emperor with his father. Obviously on paper. His real reign began only after the death of Marcus in the year 180. And his reign lasted for almost 14 years, so Commodus was analogous to Nero even in this aspect. It is unclear what Marcus really thought about his son, his character and abilities. There are contradicting reports on that. But in any case, Commodus was his only option, the only choice of a successor. He probably believed that his young age and dangerous tendencies will be balanced by the emperor's administration, which Commodus will inherit from Marcus. There are no problems with the transit of power, at least we don't know anything about it. Obviously, we have rumors that Commodus actually poisoned Marcus, but that's very unlikely. Marcus died during the campaign against the Germanic tribes, somewhere around the present day city of Vienna. He was very ill. Commodus was with him, together with a number of the emperor's close friends and advisors. So he basically just put Commodus, who already was his co-ruler, into their custody and asked to help him as well as they could. The army warmly welcomed Commodus, who was no stranger to them. They knew him for years and they admired his father. Everyone admired Marcus. He had a brilliant reputation, and part of his reputation and of this political capital were very naturally and very mechanically placed upon Commodus. It was assumed that a son of such a great man will continue the policies of his father, and will be pretty much more of the same. Despite all of the blatant character assassination attempts by the ancient historians, or the so called historians, because what we can read in Historia Augusta is not a historical account. Despite all of the slandering, it seems that Commodus remained quite popular with the people through pretty much all of his reign, just like Nero. But he was clearly seen as the enemy of the senatorial class, just like Nero. And he apparently was into shameless political PR and development of the cult of personality in the most grotesque forms, even by the Roman standards. Not unlike Nero, but on a larger scale and with a special interest in professional wrestling, gladiatorial combat, and probably with some attempts to present himself as an actual god, probably even an incarnation of Hercules, which was an interesting approach. Marcus Aurelius was obviously into political PR as well, but he presented himself as the philosopher king, and there are reports that he actually quoted Plato on this subject. He was well aware of this concept. He certainly read Plato's Republic. He knew that the senators read Plato's Republic, and he knew what his public image should be. Most importantly, he acted like a philosopher king, and he was a philosopher king. And Commodus staged games, killed a lot of beasts in the arena, and sporadically started the purges of the senators. In many ways, he turned out to be almost a direct opposite of Marcus, except maybe for the beard. It seems that most of the hatred of the Senate, and as a result, a terrible reputation for the posterity, was procured by Commodus only something like 9 or 10 years into his reign. After this moment, everything was, well, not brilliant, but it was more or less okay or quite tolerable. Nothing cataclysmic, nothing really terrifying. Yeah, he wasn't Marcus Aurelius, but nobody was Marcus Aurelius. Only after almost a decade, Commodus started killing senators by the dozens. It wasn't really mass repressions, as it may seem when you read ancient historians and all of this rain of blood by the bad emperors. 99% of all of the repressions usually dealt with the senatorial order and some people around them. All of these Roman bloodthirsty tyrants were not really Stalins or Pol Pots when repressions covered all of the social classes. Roman emperors were killing the aristocracy first and foremost, and the general population, no, not really. And also around that time, Commodus became really weird in terms of his PR and probably his ego. It just became far too much. So when these two things, purges of the senatorial class by a highly paranoid ruler and his demands to be seen as practically a god, when those two things collided, Commodus didn't last long. Only about 3 years, and then it was over. There is a certain line you'd better not cross. I mentioned all of this these events that happened only a decade into the reign of Commodus. I mentioned it for a reason. So, so we could quickly establish the main idea of today's discussion, and we could calmly discuss the early reign of Commodus, where nothing really super extravagant happens. Yeah, it reminds a bit of Tiberius or Domitian, but neither of them was really a bad emperor. They were complicated, and the Senate didn't like them, especially Domitian, who was seen as an example of extreme cruelty, even by Cassius Dio, who was a senator. But nothing over the top, if you don't open Historia Augusta, when all the accounts on Commodus are just endless orgies and lots of blood. So we will talk about the early reign, and then we will come back to the later stages. As we remember, in the year 180, Commodus was still a very young man, and he was surrounded by the friends and advisors of his father. And he was at the Danube, because that was the stage of the wars with the Marcomanni, Quadi, and other Germanic tribes. So his first decision was to finish the wars as quickly as he could and then come back to Rome. The sources try to present it as a decision dictated by his desire to abandon the more or less inhospitable frontier and lead the luxurious lifestyle in the capital. It is certainly a very biased picture. Commodus was probably not the only person who wanted to end the war. He listened to his advisors at this point, and arrival in Rome was an important thing. And this life of luxury and licentiousness were probably not the primary motives for the young emperor. It's more likely that it was dictated by politics. And actually, he could just travel to Rome and leave the armies to somebody else. So, yes, the peace treaties were rushed, but it's not like they just signed everything the next day. It took some time. The sources usually indicate that Commodus wasn't really interested in running the government. Like Nero, he was more into licentiousness and gladiatorial combat. At least that's what the ancient historians say. But anyway, he was 19, so naturally, it's hard to be of use at this age in the government. So a bulk of the emperor's administrative functions went to his Praetorian prefect, Sextus Tigidius Perennis. Or probably it happened not in 180, but a couple of years later. It's not clear in the sources, and modern historians can't agree on the year. But in any case, Perennis was very influential during the early reign of Commodus, and he probably was quite a capable man. The sources can't agree on that, and some of them actually vilify Perennis. Cassius Dio, who claims to be a witness of everything, on the other hand, speaks very favorably of Perennis and his abilities. Something very serious happened about a year or two into the reign of Commodus, which probably changed things forever and definitely changed the perception of what's going on for the emperor himself. It was a conspiracy against Commodus and the assassination attempt. And the investigation led by Perennis showed that the person behind the attempt was none other than Lucilla, the older sister of Commodus. Her intentions are not quite clear, and the reasons given by the sources sound a bit ridiculous. For example, Herodian says that Lucilla didn't like that her honors as an Augusta, the empress, were basically transferred to the wife of Commodus, Brutia Crispina. The thing is, earlier Lucilla was married to Lucius Verus, the co-emperor of Marcus Aurelius. And after the death of her husband, she still had the honors of the Augusta, like sitting in the nice, very royal chair in the theater, and a special man was always carrying a torch before Her Majesty. So she still had that even after Marcus married her to one of his friends, General Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus. By the way, The sources indicate that after the death of Commodus, Pertinax offered the title of the emperor to Pompeianus. He refused, so Pertinax became the emperor himself. Anyway, Commodus kept all these honors for his sister, but eventually, since he had a wife, she was supposed to be the first lady, and Lucilla didn't like it, and she hated her husband. Or maybe not. It all sounds a bit stupid, and Cassius Dio says that Lucilla wasn't really better than Commodus. So one of the theories is that she wanted her brother to disappear so that Pompeianus could be the emperor. The plot also included some other friends and family, uh, like another sister of Commodus and their cousins. One of the members of the plot, a nephew of Lucilla's husband, attacked Commodus with a sword and said, "Here's what the Senate sends you." He was dispatched, but it was a wake-up call for Commodus. And obviously, he couldn't trust his family members anymore and started seeing the Senate as his enemy. Who wouldn't? So after the investigation, some people had to die, including the emperor's two sisters, who first were exiled to Capri and then killed. Somehow Pompeianus was not found guilty, so he just retired to the countryside. The most logical explanation here is that he wasn't guilty. And Commodus wasn't as bloodthirsty as he is usually described, at least not in the year 182. 3 years later, under even more strange circumstances, Commodus disposed of Perennius. Dio insists that a small 1,500 strong regiment of soldiers from the legion stationed in Britannia arrived in Rome and told Commodus that Perennius is plotting against him and wants to proclaim his own son the emperor. And Commodus just let them kill Perennius and all his family. This is a weird account, and I strongly suspect that in his works, Cassius Dio is doing, well, it is called lies like an eyewitness. That's what he does. Herodian tells a different story of Perennius' demise, but it is not much better. Since then, the main control of the affairs goes to another favorite of Commodus. This time, it is his freedman and chamberlain, Clander. It shouldn't surprise you that some emperors elevated their freedmen to a position of a very significant power. The senatorial class never liked things like that, but it was more or less common practice, especially among the bad emperors who couldn't trust anybody. Nero did this as well. A freedman in this case is a person who's basically nobody without his patron. All his well-being depends on the emperor. He will never be accepted by the senators, so naturally, it is a person who will think twice before betraying his master. In the case of Nero, his trusted freedman stayed loyal to him up until his death, so now Clander basically replaced Perennius as the head of the emperor's administration. While the emperor himself was doing, well, it's not entirely clear what he was doing. It is assumed that, as you might expect, he was practicing licentiousness as a pro, and gladiatorial combat, and chariot racing. But the peak of the gladiatorial glory will be a bit later. Dio and Herodian fortunately don't give us any serious examples of abnormal sexual practices of Commodus. They are more concerned with his activities in the arena. Historia Augusta, on the other hand, doesn't ignore this facet of the leisure of the bad emperors, and it ticks all of the boxes, more or less ignoring any timeline or any idea of a structured narrative. It is just poetry written by an imbecile. 300 concubines, passive homosexual, raped his own sisters. This is our main source on the crisis of the 3rd century, by the way. The problem with Clander was, as reported by Dio, is that he was selling positions in the government and in the Senate. which was supposedly one of the important ways to procure money for outrageous and scandalous stuff that Commodus was into. Both Dio and Herodian report that at some point, it's believed that it was the year 190, but possibly earlier, Clander/Commodus duo appointed 25 consuls, for money obviously, which was a world record. And one of the consulships was actually purchased by Septimius Severus, the future emperor. Clander obviously wasn't just a chamberlain, he eventually gained an official post for himself. Just like Perennius before him, he became one of the Praetorian prefects. The year of 25 consuls, the year 190, or maybe it was year 189, different researchers come up with the different dates. So this year saw the eventual fall of Clander under, once again, quite strange circumstances. According to Cassius Dio, who, as I said earlier, quite possibly lies like an eyewitness, Clander was, in a way, killed by the angry mob. There was a shortage of food supplies in the city. The person in charge was Prefectus Anoni, called Papirius Dionysus. So supposedly this Papirius Dionysus either artificially made the shortage even more severe or just somehow transferred the blame on Cleander and possibly instigated some kind of a mini revolt when the crowd moved to see Commodus and demand Cleander's death. Commodus was at his villa outside of Rome because apparently there was an outbreak of pestilence in the city, so it wasn't a safe place. So Commodus ordered to kill Cleander and his family. As Dio says, because Commodus was a terrible coward. Papirius Dionysus soon was killed as well, which makes a lot of sense. It seems that about this time, Commodus increased his efforts to gain more and more popular support, and at the same time to deal with the possible conspiracies once and for all. Once again, kind of like Nero. And practically with the same result. The purchase included a relatively big list of the prominent senators and also the relatives of the emperor. At least 10 former consuls were executed, usually together with their families. Probably their property was confiscated as well. Then the husband of his sister, Cornificia Faustina, and her son, the emperor's nephew, were killed. The purge wasn't limited to Rome itself and also involved prominent political figures in their provinces, and a cousin of Marcus Aurelius, Faustina. It has been pointed out many times that although historians like Dio try to present all of these as insanity of a paranoid and extremely bloodthirsty man, in fact, there could be some political logic behind these actions. You cannot blame Commodus for being paranoid. People were actually plotting against him, and did all that he could to prevent the attacks. On the front of propaganda, Commodus decided that it's about time to turn his cult of personality up to 11. He asked the Senate to rename the city of Rome to Colonia Commodiana. It is believed that Colonia Commodiana is a short name. The full name was probably Colonia Lucia Antoniana Commodiana. The Senate agreed. Historia Augusta says that they intended it as a joke, because, the senators are prominent comedians. Commodus didn't stop there. He also renamed all of the 12 months to reflect his ancestry, titles, and the aspects of his character as the embodiment of Hercules. He staged even more games, where he could show his skill as a gladiator, now on a greater scale, killing hundreds of animals. Gladiatorial combat was his passion and probably a recurring PR stunt aimed at the common folk. Commodus was the unbeatable and undisputed champion of the arena. Cassius Dio also mentions that Commodus in fact was so bloodthirsty that he actually killed people during their gladiatorial fights when he staged private minigames. And in public, he obviously followed the conventional rules. And as we discussed in our video on gladiatorial combat, don't forget to check it out. The link is in the corner. The games were comparable to modern professional wrestling, and usually nobody died, except for animals, obviously. Dio specifically mentions that during the public events, Commodus fought with a shield and a wooden sword, although he says that later he started to encourage actual killing of the people in the arena. Probably the prisoners. We don't know. It's not clear from the sources. Eventually, Commodus was killed by his paranoia and negligence. It is reported that at some point he decided that a new wave of purchase must include his inner circle, which at the time included Prefect Letus, Chamberlain Eclectus, and his mistress and practically an empress in all except a name, Marcia, or Marcia, depends on how you pronounce Latin names. So here's the anecdote on how it all happened. Told by Herodian. Commodus decided to make a Soviet-style death note, a list of people who should be killed immediately. And it started with Marcia and his Chamberlain. So he put the list under the pillow. This document was discovered by a child who was running around the palace. Marcia decided to take a look and was unpleasantly surprised. She called Letus and Eclectus for an urgent meeting. What followed was the properly executed conspiracy, in the opinion of Niccolo Machiavelli, who gives this example in one of the chapters of his Discourses on Livy. They figured out that they have no time to beat around the bush. They just killed Commodus the very same day. They tried to poison him, but then they suspected that he might throw up, and the poison won't work. So they just strangled him. And that's it. No screaming, the Senate sends you this, the Senate sends you that. That was the end of the Antonine dynasty. Pertinax, an old friend of Marcus Aurelius, became the emperor. Unfortunately, a month later, he was killed, and then the darkness swallowed Rome. After the short civil war, Septimius Severus finally restored order. But this order turned out to be a military dictatorship of a Carthaginian ruler. So, thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Turn on the notifications because next time we'll be discussing Elagabalus. So, see you soon.